Yeah, so welcome to today's ESPRit online seminar. I think it's the third online seminar this year. My name is Barbara Winkler. I'm teaching modern Arabic literature and culture at the University of Münster in Germany, and I'm also a member of the ESPRit committee, and I will chair today's session. We'll have, as you see on the slide, we'll have two presentations today. The general topic of the session is knowledge transfer and materiality in and around avant-garde journals. And we're very glad to have our two speakers today, two colleagues who hosted last year's ESPRit conference at the Kassák Museum, Petőfi Literary Museum in Budapest. So we'll have first speaker is Gábor Dobó, who will present on Comrades and Censors, tracing implied and actual readers of radical periodicals during the interwar period, followed by the second presentation measure, Paul Seredi, no cliches, conflicting aspects of knowledge production and printing techniques of avant-garde periodicals. So I suppose that both presentations will be somehow related. I will, as Michael just mentioned, maybe for those who come in later, we'll have the two presentations one after the other. And so we'll have the Q&A session afterwards. But we would like to encourage you to put comments, questions in the chat already during the presentations. And also, of course, we would, as you all know from other online sessions, we would like to ask you to mute yourself during the presentations. So I'll now start presenting our first speaker. Gábor Dobó has been a research fellow at the Kassák Museum Budapest since 2015. He studied at universities in Budapest, so he gained his MA degree in 2011 and PhD degree in 2018 from Budapest University, and he has also studied in Florence for an MA degree and in Angers. Has been a visiting PhD student during the spring semester 2014. In 2022, he was a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Hungarian Institute of Columbia University, New York City. And his research focuses on modernist periodicals of the interwar period, with a special emphasis on the East and Central European region. He is currently the principal investigator of the research project titled Digital Critical Edition of the Correspondence of Lajos Kassák and Yolande Simon between 1909 and 1928, and New Perspectives for Modern Studies. He's also a member of the ESPRit committee and was, as I already mentioned, the co-organizer of the 10th ESPRit conference in Budapest last year. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be speaking to you today as part of the ESPRit online seminar lecture series. This time, instead of discussing my previous research findings, I would like to share with you the details of my current and future research plans. By doing so, I hope to engage in a dialogue with you, test some of my hypotheses, and receive your valuable feedback in the Q&A session. I believe this will be especially useful given the methodological dilemmas I face in exploring the readership of avant-garde periodicals. The question of readership has been previously addressed by some of the brilliant presentations in this seminar series dealing with archival material about journal editing. As a literary scholar whose research focuses on periodicals, I'm fortunate to be a part of the ESPRit community. In fact, as it was mentioned, I recently co-organized the 10th ESPRit conference and workshop with my colleague, Paul Seredi from the Kassák Museum, and other colleagues from the Central European Research Institute for Art History and from ESPRit. The conference held in Budapest last fall focused on geopolitical and social centers and peripheries related to periodicals. During the event, we engaged in a fruitful dialogue about various types of networks in periodical research. Here, besides a lovely group photo of the event, you can see our beautiful conference flyer that also suggested a network representation of periodicals. I am currently the principal investigator of a 4-year-long research project that was mentioned by Barbara. It is a digital critical edition of a correspondence between the earlier mentioned Lajos Kassák, who was a Hungarian avant-garde artist and journal editor, and his partner and fellow artist Jolán Simon. To achieve this, we are employing the widely used TEI XML markup language, which will allow the resulting critical edition to be processed using semantic web technology and be easily integrated into international digital humanities projects. As we process this collection of letters, I have drawn some preliminary qualitative conclusions about their content that I believe have implications for our understanding of how avant-garde journal editing occurred. My first observation is that despite being avant-garde artists and editors of several art journals, Kassák and Jolán Simon rarely wrote about art and art theory in their letters. Instead, they frequently discussed the importance of networking, a well-known characteristic of avant-garde journals. These publications were notorious for establishing and positioning themselves within a network, as well as publishing representations of their supposed centrality within the network. Therefore, it was not surprising to find that Kassák and Jolán Simon emphasized networking in their correspondence. I was, however, struck by how much they were preoccupied with the practicalities of journal production and distribution. In their letters, they discussed widely issues such as financing, finding affordable printing houses, smuggling materials across borders, and reaching audiences for their publications. Given these concerns, in my presentation on the production and consumption of cultural products, I will focus on exploring several key questions. Firstly, I will examine the producers of Hungarian avant-garde art and periodicals. Secondly, I will explore the imagined audience of these periodicals, and thirdly, their target audience. Finally, I will investigate what the target audience actually read, with the aim of gaining a deeper understanding of the relationship between these virtual and actual audiences and how they influenced the editing of journals. The Hungarian avant-garde, centered around Lajos Kassák, shared many similarities with other European avant-garde groups, engaging in various artistic and media forms, including writing, poetry, visual arts, and journal editing. Accordingly, the history of the Hungarian avant-garde is typically recounted through the publication history of Kassák's journals, which marked significant stylistic shifts in the movement. These shifts ranged from absorbing influences from, I would rather say using influences from Italian Futurism, German Expressionism, and Dada, to becoming a hub of international constructivism, and then a laboratory for a sort of surrealism in the region, and finally experimenting with grassroots community building, self-forming, and cutting-edge art around the Munka journal from the late 1920s to the late 1930s. However, the political and economic structure of these periodicals, including their financial background, circulation, performative elements, and collective cognitive and interpretative work, as well as the often hidden under-researched activities carried out by women, is often overlooked. The Kassák family came from a proletarian background, living in working-class neighborhoods and relying on industrial jobs for income. In the 1910s, Lajos Kassák's syndicalist activism led to his blacklisting from factories in Budapest. To support the family, Kassák's younger sister, Erzsi Újvári, who was also a poet, worked in a textile factory during her teenage years in the early 1910s. During the early 1920s, when Kassák lived in exile in Vienna, it was his partner, Jolán Simon, who provided financial support for Kassák and the internationally renowned avant-garde journal Ma. Jolán Simon achieved this by creating and selling applied art such as embroidered pillowcases and decorative patterns on vests. While the radical autonomy of the mock periodical was a notable achievement, it is worth noting that this success was made possible by the often invisible work undertaken by women around Kassák. Despite Kassák's working-class background and left-wing political embeddedness, the imagined readers of his journals during the early 1920s were not the proletariat, but something more generic, such as the people or brothers. Furthermore, the programmatic texts published in Kassák's avant-garde journals often addressed a community that did not exist yet, but should be created by the journal and for the journal. In fact, a comparative qualitative analysis revealed that virtually all major Hungarian little magazines, whether communists or conservative nationalists, aimed to rhetorically or performatively create their audience rather than addressing an already pre-existing readership. Kassák's periodicals were no exception in this sense. Despite the avant-garde's rhetoric of addressing the people or brothers in their programmatic texts, a closer examination of the advertisements published in the journals reveals a different target audience, the middle class. These advertisements promoted products and services associated with middle-class lifestyles and interests rather than those of the working class. Furthermore, the distribution and promotion of these journals were concentrated in middle-class areas, such as downtown boulevards, cafes, and bookshops, rather than working-class neighborhoods. This suggests that while the journals may have imagined an idealized future audience, their actual readership consisted of middle-class cultural figures and consumers. Kassák in the late 1920s turned his attention to producing a journal for a working-class audience, leading to the creation of the Munka periodical and circle. Munka means work or labor in Hungarian. This group employed avant-garde techniques to build a community within the workers' movement and left-wing print culture during the interwar period. The Munka circle hiking photo taken in 1929 shows some of the participants in the first row holding Munka periodical issues. Although the title of the periodical, which was edited by Kassák, means labor or work in Hungarian, the central project of this group was to politicize or revolutionize leisure time through sports and cutting-edge artistic activities. Members of the Munka circle pursued, published, and read related social sciences. The Munka circle's social composition was diverse, including working-class people, students, and artists. Still, information on their multifaceted activity and their embeddedness in the social democratic infrastructure is limited. While we know about the careers of certain individual artists who became famous through the Munka circle, such as the photographer Robert Capa, for example, we know much less about the environment that facilitated their artistic development. The relationship between avant-garde laboratories and working-class milieus during the 1920s and 1930s remains a historical blind spot due to historiographical and archival limitations. To approach this topic, I propose a methodological shift from the literary and art history dominated mainstream of avant-garde studies, drawing on Henri Lefebvre's critique of everyday life and Howard Zinn's people's history perspective. I examined who produced art in the working class milieu and where they pursued their artistic activities. I also investigate how wage work influenced artistic activity and the ways in which working class individuals enter the public sphere. This methodological, specifically the challenge of accessing the cultural practice of subaltern groups, such as communities in interwar Hungary. Due to their subaltern position, these activities were largely undocumented and fragmented in memory institutions. Archives and museums calibrated to dominant culture did not prioritize preserving counter-hegemonic cultural practices of workers' culture. Additionally, these practices were far removed from the professional bourgeois way of producing and consuming culture, rendering them invisible to mainstream literary and art history. Despite involving hundreds of workers' culture groups in interwar Hungary, and many of them employing avant-garde techniques in the 1920s and 1930s, their activities remains in a blind spot. Their periodicals, which promoted and documented their activities, are an important source for uncovering this history. In examining the relationship between avant-garde and working class communities, we encounter a number of challenges in archival research. One such challenge is locating evidence of working class readership in avant-garde journals. For instance, a list of subscribers for Kassák's Munka journal from the early 1930s, preserved with 160 names, reveals the professions and addresses of subscribers, among them prominent intellectuals such as the psychiatrist Lipót Szondi. However, and this goes for Peter Bius, who is an expert in psychoanalysis, including Hungarian psychiatrist as well. However, this list fails to capture working class readers. This is because of the unique reading practices of working class individuals. The list does, however, include trade union reading halls, party headquarters, and workers' club, such as the Association of Tailors, leather industry workers, glove makers, and so forth. It is important to note that media historians suggest a multiplier of 4 to 10 for the actual number of readers for each copy of a journal in the early 20th century. Therefore, a copy of Munka could potentially have several dozen, if not hundreds of readers in each worker movement reading room. To locate working class readers, a contextual analysis of working class reading practices and social democratic cultural infrastructure is necessary. Another challenge in archival research is the origin of available materials, which were often preserved by state surveillance apparatuses. For example, a Munka cover with the stamp of the Budapest Criminal Court indicates that printmakers were obligated to deliver a few copies to legal representatives once the periodical was produced. Thus, counter-hegemonic publications were frequently archived, organized, and interpreted by organizations of surveillance and dominance, as theorized by Michel Foucault. It is worth to note that censors and police can be considered one of the imagined readers of Hungarian avant-garde journals. Here you can see an envelope sent by Jolán Simon from Budapest to Lajos Kassák in Vienna. The letterhead of the mock periodical is erased by the sender. The Emigre journal was banned from Hungary, so avant-garde editors had to avoid any explicit reference to it while exchanging letters. As we come to the end of this presentation, one final question that arises is, what did working class people actually read in interwar Hungary? While we have some knowledge of the parallel society built by trade unionist and social democrat structures, and to a lesser extent by the illegal Communist Party, we still have relatively little information on the reading practices of the working class community. While Munka was one of the many socialist periodicals available at the time, it was not a typical one, and to gain a better understanding of working class reading habits, we need to look beyond this specific publication. Fortunately, there are some available sources that can give us a partial view of the reading practices of the working class community, such as the reconstruction of trade union reading hall based on an archive photo and the catalog of a social democratic bookshop. However, to get a comprehensive view, we need further research into the broader cultural infrastructure of the time. Moving on to the conclusion, we can see how Hungarian social democratic and communist calendars provide a glimpse of the working class community's unique cultural practices and informational needs. Although they included some avant-garde art and literature on their covers, they were primarily designed to provide useful information for the daily lives of working class people. It is clear that these publications were created, structured, and used in very different ways than bourgeois middle class professional, highbrow, literary and art periodicals. By examining this material, we can gain a better understanding of the challenges and opportunities involved in researching the working class embodiedness of avant-garde movements in the interwar period. Ultimately, my research has shown that the avant-garde and workers' culture had a significant impact on each other, resulting in a synthesis of radical imagination and collective emancipatory cultural practices. By analyzing print culture, we can see how avant-garde techniques attempted to rewrite the sign system within workers' culture, leading to the emergence of a counter-public that widened the political imagination, transferred knowledge, and fostered a new way of producing, performing, and consuming culture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gábor, for this very inspiring presentation. I think it raises a lot of questions which will be hopefully discussed after the second presentation. I will now introduce our second speaker, Mircea Seredi, holds an MA in art history. He's the director of the Petőfi Literary Museum, Kassák Museum at Budapest, and a PhD candidate at the Eötvös Loránd University, also in Budapest. His research focuses on Hungarian avant-garde during the 1910s and 20s, especially under Kassák and his magazine More, so Today, in Vienna between 1920 and 1925. He has published essays in various languages, in Hungarian, English, and German, in academic journals. He has edited volumes and exhibition catalogs, and he has curated several exhibitions at the Kassák Museum. He has also co-edited the volume Art and Action, published in 2018 on avant-garde journals, edited by the Hungarian author, visual artist, and theoretician Lajos Kassák between 1915 and 1927. So I'm looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You can hear me all right? Okay. So, in the following, I will focus on some visual aspects of the production of avant-garde periodicals during the 1910s and 1920s, with a special emphasis on Lajos Kassák's magazines and the related archive in the Kassák Museum. Kassák's magazines, edited in Hungary and Austria and published in Hungarian but with an international horizon, supplemented by Kassák's surviving editorial archive, could constitute a productive basis to formulate research questions that could be applied to a larger scope of magazines and editorial practices. Photomechanical halftone or offset reproduction techniques took over magazine and book production by the mid-1920s. The evolution of photographic reproductions boosted a plethora of illustrated magazines on the commercial market, but also had a large impact on the editorial and design process of little magazines, especially those connected to groups of modernist and avant-garde artists that had a special emphasis on accommodating technological advances into their editorial work. This, however, resulted in new challenges affecting the financial background of these publications in particular. Kassák, as the leading organizer of the Hungarian avant-garde movement, acted independently and without any substantial financial background and funds, besides the income from subscribers and occasional readers of the magazine. Kassák and his partner, Jolán Simon, were committed to sustaining their projects and subsidized printing costs with their own modest income, as mentioned by Gábor earlier. Yet, especially during the 1920s, Kassák managed to adjust the layout and contents of his magazine in a way that stood out even within the European avant-garde landscape. This was due to his successful international networking and the, so to speak, secondary market of printing blocks depicting reproductions of artworks. During the First World War, Kassák modeled his magazine Ma on Herwart Walden's Berlin Expressionist enterprise Der Sturm. Besides the obvious copy of the layout, Kassák also adapted the extensive use of letterpress reproductive graphic techniques, including woodcuts and lino cuts, that were printed into the magazine directly from the printing block etched by the artist. Thus, Kassák enabled his young colleagues in visual arts to publish their expressionist compositions, usually copying their own paintings in black and white, with little to no cost in the magazine. Kassák also included half-tone autotype plates, or as they were once called clichés in Ma during the 1910s, to illustrate international currents of avant-garde art, presumably borrowed from Herwart Walden's Berlin stock. Besides their corresponding artistic interests, both magazines shared a firm pacifist and leftist political stance that connected them on an ideological level as well. As a non-profit endeavor, Kassák never paid to his authors, and he often asked visual artists to cover the costs of making the half-tone clichés of their own works. We can cite here Kassák's letter to Tristan Tzara in December 1921, where he described the price of clichés in Vienna at the time in great detail, trying to convince Francis Picabia to send materials for a special issue of Ma dedicated to his texts and images, and to cover the costs of making the clichés based on photos of his artworks. From 1920 on, Kassák was forced to continue his work in exile in Vienna. He lost his financial background and his established audience, and his magazine was denounced as a communist publication and was banned distribution in Hungary. Kassák continued to address a Hungarian audience with his magazine, distributing it amongst Hungarians in exile in Austria and those living in the detached territories of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy. However, after the First World War, Kassák was able to expand his international network beyond Berlin Expressionism, and driven by his curiosity, as well as by his financial compulsion, his magazine soon managed to become a hub in the newly established international network of Dadaist and constructivist magazines. The first Dada artist whose works Kassák published in Ma was the Hannover Märzkünstler Kurt Schwitters. According to their correspondence, Kassák asked Schwitters and his publisher for both manuscripts and half-tone clichés. Schwitters, who just produced a series of reproductions of his recent works for a postcard series, was able to provide these printing blocks, the same ones that have been used in other avant-garde magazines, such as Der Ararat and Der Sturm a year earlier. Due to the unstable financial background of Ma in Vienna, Kassák was forced to ask his newly established international contacts to lend him half-tone clichés via post. This work required an extension of his editorial practices, including correspondence with international partners, as well as the tiring work of collecting and managing the return of half-tone clichés. Most of Kassák's surviving correspondence with editors of international magazines deal with these details, and Kassák had the most extensive correspondence with Tristan Tzara, who was himself working on an extensive anthology of Dadaist texts and images called Dada Globe, that wasn't realized at the time, but was reconstructed by Adrian Sudhalter as a centenary exhibition of Dadaism in 2016. And therefore, Tzara have also had several reproductions on hand during the time he was in contact with Kassák. Also, Tzara, by the time residing in Paris, acted as an intermediary between avant-garde editors. His intercession resulted in seemingly implausible contacts, such as Kassák publishing reproductions of paintings by French Cubist artists such as Picasso and Braque, from half-tone clichés made by the Chilean poet Vicente Huidobro for his short-lived Madrid-based magazine Creación in Paris a few months earlier. Besides Tzara, the most important source of clichés was László Moholy-Nagy for Kassák. Moholy-Nagy moved to Berlin early 1921, and he made his debut as a visual artist in several galleries and soon established contact with the Berlin Dada circles. Kassák and Moholy-Nagy decided to make an anthology of contemporary art, a project that resulted in the Book of New Artists published in September 1922. The editorial process of collecting and making half-tone cliches for this anthology span across a year, and even though most of the editorial correspondence is now lost, the book itself proves to be an important source of as Kassák included credit lines for the cliches in the index of the volume. This list, compared with the cliches used in Ma before and after the publication of this album, as well as an overview of the same photos in magazines listed as the source of these cliches, could be used as a basis of reconstructing poster routes for several printing blocks. For example, Sophie Teuber's painting was reproduced based on a photo that Sophie had left with Kassák when she visited Vienna during autumn 1921. We have the photo in Kassák's archives with remarks by the technicians to make the cliché. Sophie Teuber's visit to Vienna could shed light to an interesting example of Kassák's financial means preventing him of publishing important visual materials. During spring and summer 1921, Kassák's brother-in-law and co-editor, the painter Béla Ujc, visited Moscow as the member of the Hungarian delegation for the Third Comintern Congress. He collected visual materials, including photos of artworks by contemporary Russian constructivists, manifestos and books, and he sent these to Kassák in Vienna immediately. However, Kassák wasn't able to make cliches of these photos, and so he didn't publish any of the new Russian materials in his magazine and relied on second-hand cliches from magazines such as The Stel and Vest throughout 1921 and early 1922. However, from a correspondence by Sophie Teuber, the partner of Hans Arp, who visited Vienna and conversed with Kassák in detail, we know that Kassák showed her these Russian materials and discussed these privately. After returning to Vienna in September 1921, Ujc departed from Kassák and started a counter magazine to Ma, which was called Egység or Unity, where he propagated prolet cult and published many of the photos he had collected in Moscow with the Communist Party funds to precede Kassák in showing constructivism and new Russian art in general in Western Europe. In the Book of New Artists, Kassák used the second-hand half-tone cliché of the Moscow exhibition of constructivists from 1921, based on Lisitsky's magazine Vest, even though Ujc had made a cliché of another photo of the same exhibition and used it in his magazines a few months earlier in Vienna. The half-tone cliché of Lisitsky's artwork called Praun 1D was made by Lisitsky and Ilya Ehrenburg in Berlin during spring 1922 and was used by Kassák and Moholy-Nagy in the Book of New Artists. This cliché was previously printed not in the magazine Vest, but in Ehrenburg's lavishly illustrated Russian language book on avant-garde art called And the Edward Goes Around, published in Berlin. In the Book of New Artists, Kassák named the magazine Vest as the source of the cliché. Kassák reprinted the same reproduction again in the October 1922 issue of Ma. This was accompanied by a Hungarian translation of the original 1919 Russian manifesto Praun by Lisitsky that was available to Kassák and his colleagues in Vienna as it was sent to them from Moscow by Ujc earlier. So here you can see the text from one source and the image from another source. On the other hand, Kassák made a cliché of a painting by the suprematist painter Olga Rozanova from the collection of photos sent from Moscow by Ujc. This cliché was used in the Book of New Artists as well as the December 1922 issue of Ma, where it illustrated Kassák's article about the Berlin exhibition of new Russian art that he visited a few weeks before. Once again, we have the original photo in Kassák's archives, with possibly Ujc's remarks saying that this particular painting is not the best work by Rozanova, yet Kassák published it twice as he had the cliché at hand. After the Russian state support for Lisitsky and Ehrenburg's project Vesh dried up in late spring 1922, Lisitsky struggled to have his newer works published. In a letter sent to Theo van Doesburg, he complained that magazines such as Ma and Yugoslavian Zenit, that both Lisitsky and van Doesburg considered important forums for new art, required him to pay for the cliches that he couldn't afford. This could explain why Lisitsky returned to letterpress graphic techniques and published lino cuts on the cover of both magazines later, but already during 1922. Special letterpress techniques were used by Kassák on purpose as well during the Vienna years. For example, the May 1922 so-called Exile Jubilee issue of Ma was decorated by 2 Polkovar stencil prints reproducing Moholinoid's paintings and Raoul Hausmann's Dadaist composition. This Polkovar stencil technique was used by Sándor Bortnyik, a visual artist colleague of Kassák, a year before to make his debut portfolio of 6 Dadaist-inspired abstract prints. After the publication of the Book of New Artists, Kassák's place within the international avant-garde community was strengthened effectively. Networking and republishing materials from other magazines was made much more easier for him, and that allowed several successful projects during the next years. For example, in September 1924, Kassák was able to pull off a spite issue of Ma directed towards Austrian avant-garde theater designer and later American architect Friedrich Kiesler, who excluded Kassák from the organizational committee of an exhibition of avant-garde theater techniques opened just a week after the publication of Kassák's special issue on new theater and music. Based on a few surviving letters, Kassák assembled the content of this issue within just a few weeks during the summer of 1924, and was supported by a vast network of like-minded editors and artists. This issue of Ma used cliches of photos of avant-garde Russian, French, and German theater productions, borrowed, among others, from the magazine Stavba, a Czech architectural magazine managed by Karel Teige, the magazine Querschnitt, which was an illustrated German magazine with a Hungarian contributor in the person of Bauhaus-related art critic Ernst Kállai, as well as Hannes Meyer's co-op theater project, who was linked to Lisitsky and Moholinoid in the Weimar Bauhaus. As a last point, the question remains, where are these half-tone cliches now? In the case of Kassák, these are most possibly lost and not to be recovered. When he moved back to Budapest in 1926, Kassák left many of his editorial materials in Vienna, where they maintained their rented apartment from some time. In a letter sent to one of their associates during late 1926 from Budapest to Vienna, Jolán Simon gave detailed instructions to their young colleague to collect specific cliches from their archive, kept in a large box, and to transfer them back to Budapest to be used in the first issue of Kassák's new magazine entitled Document. This letter gives a quite detailed description of the Vienna editorial archive. However, the further case of these printing blocks are not documented. As a conclusion, I would like to point out possible ways to further this kind of engagement with half-tone reproductions in little magazines. On one hand, my research is based on extensive source materials collected from several archives, including magazines, editorial correspondence, vintage photos of artworks, and provenance research of individual artworks. However, this qualitative research has a narrow scope, and as this kind of research has not yet been done on other magazines and editorial archives, it is not possible to instantly embed my results to a larger corpus of knowledge on the informal market of half-tone printing blocks. This kind of research could be expanded into a quantitative scale through the involvement of automatized analysis of high-resolution scans of a larger corpus of magazines. Visual recognition software could analyze and compare reproductions and even determine if the half-tone printing blocks were identical or different for reproductions of the same image. A systematically built semantic web-based database of little magazines with consequently applied metadata could also be useful to uncover such connections. Even though mass digitization projects of libraries made most of these magazines accessible in low-resolution PDF scans, and open access web repositories such as Monoscope revolutionized research into modernist and avant-garde networks, these scans doesn't allow digital humanities researchers to harvest data in an automatized way. As a part of the Kassák Museum's research project on magazines, we were trying to create a semantic web-based version of Kassák's avant-garde magazines. Even though our project is nearly finished, at the moment it seems that we now lack necessary institutional and financial support to finish this pilot, originally intended as a starting point for a digitization project on a Central European scale. Besides the consideration for digital humanities, I would conclude that a special focus on archival materials and close reading of both written and visual sources could be useful in furthering research on avant-garde and modernist networks of magazines. Even though editorial archives kept together to the extent of Kassák and Censors are rare, these are not unique. Through the analysis of the interconnected web of correspondence and the informal market of half-tone cliches and other materials between editors, we could uncover formerly overlooked layers of avant-garde and modernist networks during the early 20th century. Thank you very much for your attention.